I watch a lot of Food Network, and I mean a lot of it. So I thought today I'd take one of my favorite Food Network shows and kind of turn it into a lesson on the basic components of a compelling story. And yes, this is mostly a desperate attempt to justify how much Food Network I watch, but it's also good information. I hope. So we're going to look at Restaurant Impossible, which has a pretty simple premise. Robert Irvine, the host, has 2 days and $10,000 to save a failing restaurant. Each episode follows exactly the same formula. It is the definition of formulaic, and yet it's always interesting, and I think part of the reason is that it hits all the points that any good story should and does. First, the protagonist has both a clear goal and a clear motivation. Now, in the case of Restaurant Impossible, the protagonists are always the owners of the restaurant, and the goal is always to save the failing restaurant. Pretty simple, pretty clear. There can be some variety in terms of the motivation behind the goals, but they tend to follow a similar pattern, either something like easing tension in family relationships, or saving their livelihood, or just following their passion. So while the specific motivations can vary a touch, it's always clear within the first 5 minutes of each episode why the person wants to save the restaurant. And that's really important to have upfront, a clear goal and a clear motivation for your protagonist. Somewhat related as well is the stakes. So what's at stake here? What happens if the character doesn't succeed? In this specific case, what happens if the restaurant fails? Maybe they'll lose their house, maybe their marriage will crumble, maybe they'll just have to go with their lifelong dream of owning a restaurant and go work in an office somewhere. Who knows? But the stakes need to be clear, because clear stakes combined with the goal and motivation immediately make the viewer or the reader care about the characters in the story. It's a lot easier to get emotionally invested in a story up front if we know what the character wants, why they want it, and what'll happen if they don't get it. Next come the obstacles, the conflicts, the things that are keeping your character from reaching their goal. In this case, there are some obvious external obstacles that the characters have to overcome, specifically the 2-day time frame and the $10,000 limit. Now, there's a reason this show is called Restaurant Impossible, because it should be impossible to completely redo a restaurant within those constraints. And the viewer knows this. They know that this is a very difficult thing to accomplish given those constraints, and that immediately injects a sense of urgency into the story and ups the tension a lot for the viewer, which is good. That's what you want. Tension is good. And while those external conflicts are really important for keeping the viewer and the reader engaged, it's those internal conflicts where the heart of the story rests. The protagonist of any story, in this case the restaurant owners, always has an internal conflict that's making it more difficult to reach their goal. For instance, in an episode I saw recently, the restaurant was clearly failing because the prices were too high on the menu for that neighborhood, and nobody was coming because they couldn't afford to. But the owners were very elitist and had this block in their heads that they couldn't change the menu, and they wouldn't change the menu or give up this ideal that they held of owning an elite restaurant. And that drove the whole arc of the story of that episode. There's always some internal flaw, internal fear, internal conflict that is driving the story and the protagonist, and that they'll ultimately have to confront. Now, I think the show would work even if you only had the above elements that we talked about, but it's the final element that makes the show really special and really shine, and that is voice. The host, Robert Irvine, is our narrator. He's the lens through which everything else is framed, and it's his voice that tells us the story. It's his voice, which is compelling and strong in its own right, that makes even a weak episode really interesting to watch. I think a strong narrative voice is one of the most important elements to any good story, but it's something that I don't see taught a lot in classes or workshops or whatever, and I think a lot of that has to do with because it's more difficult to teach than like goal, motivation, conflict, etc. But it's a really important thing to consider when you're writing is what is your narrative voice, who's telling the story, how are they telling it, how are they framing it for the reader. And I think that's something we can learn from Restaurant Impossible and Mr. Robert Irvine. So what I want you to take away from Restaurant Impossible, which I encourage you to watch because it's a very good show, is that any good story is going to have certain elements, certain basic elements, which include things like goal, motivation, stakes, external conflict, internal conflict, and voice. Obviously, there are going to be other elements in a good story as well, like world building and tone and things like that, but those are the basic building blocks of a good story, and so there you have it. Lessons from the Food Network. Who'da thunk? I hope that was helpful. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving, and I will see you all next week.